Hello, you dirty potters. How are you today? Yeah, you like that? You like that potter swirl right there? I'm gonna teach you how to do this today. Today I'm gonna teach you potters how to accomplish the potter's swirl. The potter's swirl is extremely easy. It's really just a form with a nice swirl going through the ceramic art body. And most intermediate potters know how to do this. Let's face it, at some point you've probably seen your favorite YouTuber or Instagram potter do this on one of their forms, and it's a very versatile thing to do. Usually what happens is after a beginner potter learns how to make all their base forms, their bowls, their teacups, their pots, their lidded jars, their plates, things of that nature, they start to play with their forms. And the first thing they do is altering the form of what would be considered a normal bowl. You want to learn how to make something a little bit different and artistic? You put a swirl in it. And the potter's swirl is one of those things that almost every single intermediate potter goes through. It's one of the easiest and first things we learn how to do when we're altering a form on the wheel. Now before we get started, there's not one end-all be-all way to do this. There's actually about 3 or 4 different ways to accomplish this, and the understanding of how to accomplish this really goes into those 3 or 4 different ways. So the first thing we're going to do is go through the foundation of what actually makes this potter's swirl. Because once I show you how I perform the potter's swirl, I think you'll start to understand what's really going on inside the clay body. But first, we have to throw a form. Before we get started with this example, I want to show you potters the speed at which I'm pulling my walls on a usual basis. To measure that, I'm going to put a line right here. This way you can see the rotation as I slowly pull through the cylinder. And we're going to do this again, but we're going to do the potter swirl technique on top of it next time.
Little.
That is how I usually do my first pull. You can still see the little slit that I made right there. And that's the speed at which I usually pull my very first pull. Most potters pull about 1 or 2 times before they start really forming what they're gonna make, depending on the size of the clay body. Now, let me show you how I would pull if I was making a potter's swirl. But this time, I want you to count how long it takes me to pull something and count how many times this goes around at the same time. The mark is still right here. I know we're going a long way, but trust me, this is gonna matter. The takeaway from this is that making a potter's swirl and pulling your cylinder regularly are literally both the same action. One of them is just way faster. Most of you probably already know how to accomplish the potter's swirl. The only real difference is that instead of methodically pulling and waiting for one rotation at this point here and then moving up a bit slowly, methodically, just kind of making sure everything's even, all you really have to do is pull super fast and make sure you don't unstabilize the clay body. That's about it. Pulling your clay cylinder and making the potter's swirl are literally the same action. One is just faster. And after you learn how to control the speed of which you're pulling to make that spiral, the only difference after that is to either increase the speed or decrease the speed to get either more or less spirals. And that's about it. That's all you really have to do. But just in case you're still having trouble creating the potter's swirl, there's a couple different things that'll help you create it. So let's go over those real quick. First, you just have to create your form. Whatever you're trying to put the swirl inside of, don't try and do it while you're making the form. Make your form complete, finish it off, and then decide to put the potter's swirl in it. So for this one, we're gonna make a bowl.
Little.
There's a tiny bit of a trick to making the potter's swirl whenever you're trying to make it on a form. Number 1, most of you already know when you're pulling, you usually have your fingers equal just like this. As you pull a form, the clay gets a little bit raised up by you squeezing the form, but you're squeezing on equal parts. You're squeezing like this with your fingers together, but while you're making the potter's swirl, it might benefit you, especially if you're having a bit of a hard time, to kind of offset your fingers like this. This way, the clay sits right here in between this small wedge of space as you're pulling, and it'll slowly start to make that spiral by itself as long as you don't lose stability. I'm right-handed, so if I decide to put my right hand on the very bottom, while my middle finger of my left hand is right about here, and pull very quickly, let's make it a 2-second pull. 1, 2, and then slowly release. I'm gonna create spirals, just like this. This is basically how you create the potter's swirl, but be careful with offsetting your fingers like this. If you push too hard, the clay will collapse on itself. This is why I usually like to just do it how I regularly pull, although if you still haven't gotten the hang of it, that offsetting of the fingers will really help you out. If you mess up on a form, because I did say we were gonna make a bowl out of this, you can always take your hand, really start to push outwards with your clay body, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, it'll go right back into form. This is very valuable, as if you mess up on your swirl the first time, you can try a second or third time. Be careful though, because sometimes your clay will just get tired and it simply won't do any more work for you. It'll just kind of flop down. So sometimes if you're good about compressing your clay back into its normal form, you can give yourself a second chance to create an even better swirl than you had before. This is also kind of a plan B technique for anything that you might mess up. Let's say you're pumping out a bunch of bowls and you accidentally mess one up. You get up to go clean your wheel and oops, you accidentally bump your clay body. And now you have one or two options. You can either waste product or you can give it a nice little potter swirl. And now your teacher will never know the difference. That's right, teacher. I didn't mess up on my bowl that I've tried to make 10 times today. I just gave it swag. By this point, you already probably get the gist of how to make the potter's swirl. Just pull a little bit slower and sometimes offset your fingers. As long as you're stable and you know how to pull in the first place, as you should, because most intermediate potters can do this technique by this point, you should be fine. So let's go over the 4 ways that I am fairly comfortable with making spirals or potter's swirls inside of pottery real quick. And I'll try to explain the utility of each one as we go along, because this video is getting kind of long and according to YouTube, you guys have no attention span whatsoever. This is the normal potter's swirl. This is not only the most basic of potter swirls, but I'm willing to bet that the first person who did this probably just pulled way too fast or incorrectly and thought that this looked really pretty and decided to make it a technique. I have no historical knowledge to back that up. I'm just willing to bet, as far as potter lore goes, one person just messed up their form and was like, oh, that looks kind of nice. In this one, the swirls are spaced relatively far apart. There's about maybe 4 or 5 maximum swirls, and most people stop right here on the lip because you don't want the lip to have a swirl and come up a little bit. This is constant throughout most of the swirls, as most people will stop right here to not disturb the lip.
Ryan Little.
This is also the normal potter's swirl, but the difference is, as you can see, that the coils or the swirls are really tight knit and close together. While the rules still apply of the previous potter swirl technique, I just went a little bit slower. Instead of just doing a 2 to 3 second pull and just pushing pressure on your fingers, you have to purposely put your fingers in a certain position and go up the body very, very slowly. Even if you're offsetting your fingers like I showed you previously in the video, you still have to go fairly slow. I'm just gonna keep all these and sell them on the website.
Please notice me,
Sell them.
senpai!
Now this one's a little bit harder to explain. You see this mug right here? This mug right here was made with my right hand with swirls going upward. You can tell because the swirls are going in that direction. They're coming up in this direction as I swirl them. This means that if I put my hand, as most people would normally grab a cup, it's not going in that direction. My hand usually holds a cup like this, going up in this direction. Very few people are holding their mugs like this, okay? This ain't right. You shouldn't be holding a mug like this. If I see you holding a mug like this in public, it's on sight, okay? As the spirals are coming up and to the right like this, most people aren't holding their cups at that angle. Most people hold them at this angle, going up this way instead of this way. There's a very easy way to fix this. While you're making your spirals, and yes, it's a little bit more difficult, you can very easily either reverse or put the spirals going downwards. This means that as you make your swirl, you're not starting from the bottom and going upwards, you're starting from the top and going downwards. So if somebody did decide to grab a mug like this, it'd be a little bit more ergonomic. This means it's a little bit more comfortable for the hands to hold. Your fingers would fit directly into the grooves instead of going this way like a normal swirl would. Now I gotta pick up this wet product. Hopefully you can see the difference. These lines here are going up and this way, the normal way that most people would hold their cups. So my fingertips will fit very nicely into the grooves of this potter's swirl. As for this one here, these lines go up and this way. Even if I'm right or left-handed, it doesn't really matter. Your hands are still gonna be holding your cup like this, which means to make it super comfortable, I would have to hold my mug like this, which no one better be doing, I swear, I will find you. This reverse swirl is accomplished by doing the same exact thing that we did with the other two cups. The only difference is I'm starting from the top and moving downwards instead of moving from the bottom and moving upwards. That's it. It doesn't matter if you're right or left-handed, it'll still work. Just go from top down instead of down up. The third and final potter swirl technique is the one finger technique. Now I won't lie to you, this is kind of a Hail Mary. If you have tried everything else and you literally don't know how to do the potter swirl, using one finger is not exactly functional, won't get you really deep spiral grooves, but it'll work. What I want you to do, like every other technique, make sure you wet the outside of your cylinder. You should be wetting the outside and the inside as you do these techniques, but for this specific one finger technique, you just have to wet the outside as you will not be putting your hand inside of the cylinder. Put your finger at the bottom of the cylinder right here and start zooming your way up the cylinder while pressing really hard. The key difference is that when you get up to here, you have to remember to take your finger off very slowly. Sometimes I'll put my finger all the way up here, kind of straighten this out a bit, and then I'll slowly let go to make sure that the rim is nice and even. Remember, you don't want to mess up the rim while doing this technique. This way is a little bit easier for anyone who's really having trouble pulling and getting their timing down with pulling that nice straight spiral. The main negative of this is if you push too hard, your body will start to smush in on itself. You can actually probably see a little bit of it happening over here as I did this one finger technique. But if you catch onto that, start releasing pressure a little bit and slowly come to the top, straighten out the top just like this as it spins, and slowly release. You have to release slowly or else you'll mess up the entire thing. Before, while you were pulling, you could very easily stabilize the whole thing as you pull. This time, you're only messing with the outside, so the inside is gonna look a little bit different. But if you're still having trouble pulling a little bit, this will also work if you really wanna get that spiral down. It's actually pretty good practice for later on. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. I just wanted to make an episode about how to make the potter's swirl. There's a bit of confusion about it. It really just whittles down to pulling a little bit faster than you've already been pulling. And the slower you pull, the more spirals you'll get. To the point where if you're pulling how you're supposed to pull, you're probably pulling very slowly in comparison to this technique. But I also wanted to show you the couple different ways there are to make different types of spirals and what they're used for. One of these is a little bit more ergonomic, one of them is very normal, one of them has more spirals, and the other one is just kind of a cheese way to make spirals because, you know, you couldn't do it the regular way. Please trust me when I say everyone who doesn't know how to make the potter's swirl thinks it's super fancy, but once you learn how to make the potter's swirl, you go through like a 6-month long process where you make nothing but swirls on your forms, and then after a while it kind of loses its magic. You're like, oh yeah, that's what I do when I don't know what else to do with a straight form. I just kind of put a spiral in it and people think it's fancy. But thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, say hi. Let me know you made it to the end down below. I know according to YouTube, they're like, look man, nobody makes it to the end of every single video. Which I'm told is super normal, but also I like to think you guys have more of an attention span than that. Please prove me right. If you'd like to see any of my artwork, the links are always down below. The podcast with me and Lindsay M. Dillon, my website/store where you can buy some of my stuff, my Instagram, the Facebook, all the things. You know where the things are. You know where the things are. You click the things are down below. You go do the thing. You're good to go. Good luck on your next art project, and I will see you, Dirty Potters, next week. It's gonna be so hard. The camera's like directly on the wheel. Y'all better be clicking that like button.